Hi, it's Mark on No Book Left Behind and welcome to my top 10 reads of 2025. So welcome, and here we are at the end of the year, so it's time to count down my top 10 reads of the year, although they're not really in any particular order, although I do name my favourite fiction and non-fiction books at the end. Now, full disclosure here, some of these selections haven't been featured on the channel before because I only started the channel in September, and of course there was plenty of reading done before then. So, are you sitting comfortably? Let's begin with number 10. So number 10 is Rose Gold by Walter Mosley, published in 2014. It's the most recent book here, and the 13th in his series of E.Z. Rawlins mysteries. Now, if you're not familiar, E.Z. Rawlins is a black man living in LA. The series begins in the 1940s when he takes an off-the-books job looking for a white woman in the African-American part of town. Over the years, he becomes a private investigator, and the series follows him chronologically through the decades until we get to Rose Gold, which takes place in 1967. Senior LAPD officials ask E.Z. to track down a white woman, the daughter of a prominent and very rich arms manufacturer who is apparently taken up with a black radical ex-boxer, although kidnapping may also be involved, which has brought the FBI in on the case. On the very first day of the investigation, E.Z. is shot at and almost killed, which kind of sets the tone for the rest of the story. Now, what I particularly love about this series is that at heart E.Z. is just a working Joe trying to make ends meet, and the novels follow him chronologically through the decades, and we get an alternate black man's vision of recent American history and culture. In fact, sometimes his day-to-day struggles do seem to take a bit of a backseat to the mysteries involved, and for me that's possibly the one flaw in the series. However, on this occasion in Rose Gold, I think the balance is exactly right. So if you like your crime with a little more weight and gravitas, I couldn't recommend the E.Z. Rawlins series highly enough, and Rose Gold was an obvious inclusion in this top 10. So this is an unusual entry at number 9. This is Mysterious Martin, For Art's Sake, 2 short novels in 1 volume by Todd Robbins. Now, Todd Robbins was an American author of the early 20th century, and Mysterious Martin was his first novel, at least arguably his first novel. Career and autobiographical information about Robbins is a little hard to find. Now, this is a tale told by aspiring young portrait painter Charles Smithers, whose younger brother Paul introduces him to the enigmatic Sterling Martin. Like Charlie, Martin is off to Paris to study art, and Paul suggests that the two of them room together in the city. Now, Charlie takes an instant dislike to Martin, but is persuaded to agree when he sees a stunning example of the latter's work. Now, this is a portrait of a young girl who has just been murdered, something Martin witnessed in real life after she was attacked by a fellow student. Martin confesses, however, that he will never be a great artist because he has no imagination whatsoever. What he does have is a genius for being able to remember things that he witnesses and depict them on canvas. This is a very short, very early serial killer novel, and one that intimately links the creative process with murder. Now, to a modern audience, it's pretty clear what's going on from the get-go, but I couldn't help but wonder if contemporary readers regarded this as more of a mystery. Okay, killers and villains have been ever-present in literature from the beginning, but those characters tended to have solid motives, like financial gain, twisted love, or revenge. The motives of the killer here are far more obscure, despite his efforts to explain himself. So what we have is a very modern-feeling character, a manipulative, narcissistic monster who kills partly because he can and partly to satisfy his artistic cravings. It's certainly a weird one. Robbins was always apparently a little dissatisfied with Mysterious Martin, as almost a decade later he did a thorough rewrite and expanded it into a more full-length novel and called it For Art's Sake, which is included in this volume as well. But even that was not enough, as he did it again in 1933, some 13 years later, and called it The Master of Murder, although apparently that is a fairly minor revision. For Art's Sake, on the other hand, adds quite a lot to the original story of Mysterious Martin, with some new scenes, new characters, and a little more plot development, although it does not change the main thread of the original narrative. I preferred it slightly, as it feels like a more full-rounded work, although I do know that some people prefer the rougher edges of the original. I found both to be completely compulsive reading, and it was an easy spot for this top 10 list. And number 8 is the first of 3 non-fiction books on the list. And this one is No One Here Gets Out Alive by Danny Sugarman and Jerry Hopkins. And this is the definitive biography of Jim Morrison, the lead singer and songwriter of 1960s psychedelic rock band The Doors. Now, despite being a huge fan of The Doors, I've been put off reading this book for many years. Both Hopkins and Sugarman knew Morrison, at least to some extent. Hopkins interviewed him a couple of times as a journalist back in the day, and Sugarman actually worked in the Doors office from the age of 12, and later on became the band's manager. But I'd heard that this book was little more than an exercise in hero worship, an attempt to elevate Morrison into this cosmic shaman role, much favoured by Oliver Stone in his 1991 biography The Doors, enjoyable as that movie was. But when I read the book, I actually found that opinion very hard to reconcile to the contents. In the end, my impression of Morrison is a man very much wrapped up in himself. Not a bad man necessarily, but one who definitely had problems relating to other people, which led to quite a few occasions of pretty shitty behaviour. There are a couple of stories of his childhood, for instance, where he put his siblings in harm's way deliberately, just because he felt it was amusing and without any empathy as to how scared they actually were. The overwhelming impression that I get is later estrangement from his family and deep explorations into the world of alcohol and drugs were fueled by one simple thing: boredom. I hadn't realised that Morrison was such an incredible brain box and was even studying philosophy by the age of 12. And I think the boredom with everyday life and people in general may have driven him to pushing the envelope, something he embraced wholeheartedly, with often quite dodgy and unfortunate results. But that's enough of a bit of pop psychiatry there. Other things that I didn't know about the band and about Morrison himself. He actually came from quite a privileged background. His father eventually became a very high-ranking admiral in the US Navy. It was only 6 months after keyboard player Ray Manzarek and Morrison came up with this vague idea of forming a band that the Doors were actually sitting at number 1 in the US singles chart with Light My Fire, an incredibly meteoric rise and the exact opposite of paying your dues for years and years. The sheer pace and pressure involved with having a successful musical career in the 1960s is quite frightening. Bands would routinely put out 2 albums a year and tour constantly to support them. There was no taking a few years off to write a few more hits for the next album back in those days. The dark business side and the sheer headlong chaos do make for a fascinating backdrop to Morrison's story. Now, I love this biography. There was plenty of fascinating detail and it seemed fair and balanced to me. Morrison comes over as a man who was supremely talented and was staunchly loyal to friends, but also had a very dark and unfortunate side. And of course you don't really get to know the real man too well, because most of the time he was hidden behind this heavy blanket of booze and drugs. And you can't help but wonder what sort of man and what sort of artist he would have been if he'd managed to stay clean and sober. And number 7 on the list is Hollow Triumph by Murray Forbes. Now, I've already done a full video on this one, so if this sounds like it's your bag, perhaps you should go and check that one out. Now, this is the story of a small-time criminal called Henry Muller, who is actually supremely intelligent but also supremely narcissistic. Henry feels that the world owes him the richest things it has to offer simply because he's Henry Muller, and he determines that he's going to go out and get them by any means necessary. After finishing a 5-year stretch in jail for forgery, he happens to find out that there's a psychiatrist in Chicago who is the spitting image of him. And so he plans to kill this doppelganger and take his place, living his life. Can he do it? Will his impersonation be discovered? Now, this is not so much actually a noir thriller as a character study, as despite being written in the third person, we spend an awful lot of time in Henry's head. In fact, almost in the entire novel. And that's great, because Henry's head is truly a fascinating place to be. This is a unique portrait of a high-functioning sociopath, whose intelligence allows him to function very successfully in Bartok's professional life, if not so successfully in his personal one. You see, anyone who crosses Bartok's path tends to come out a lot the worse for wear, particularly the women concerned, and sometimes the consequences are fatal. You see, Henry isn't actively vindictive toward anyone. It's just that they are all secondary to what is good for Henry Muller, and he takes this to extreme lengths. And I found this one very fascinating indeed, very absorbing and very thought-provoking. A film version followed in 1948, starring Paul Honreid and Joe Bennett, and although it's a pretty decent noir film, it's not the book. They had to soften things down and change certain parts of the story quite considerably. But I would certainly recommend the book. There's nothing I've read that's quite like it. The biggest shame was that Forbes never wrote another thing. And next we have a real treat, because this is Roarings from Further Out, 4 weird novellas by Algernon Blackwood. Now, you'll probably notice, if you recognise the type of design here, this is part of the British Library's Tales of the Weird series, which I have started to review on the channel. Now, I have reviewed the first 6 volumes of it. This was not one of them, because when I originally bought my very first Tales from the Weird book, I got it in a batch with 2 others, and this was one of the others. Now, Algernon Blackwood is a name I've come across many times over the years, but I've never had the opportunity to try any of his writing. And this book contains 2 of his most famous stories, The Willows and The Wendigo, so this is kind of the perfect place to start. Now, I'm not someone who normally likes a lot of descriptive passages in his fiction, particularly those relating to the weather, the landscape and nature in general. However, Blackwood is the exception that proves the rule. His stories are filled with exactly that type of description, but here he uses it for the purposes of building mood, suspense and unease, and he's quite honestly a master at it. I was blown away by these stories. They have a raw, a sinister intensity that really grabbed me. And they perfectly capture Blackwood's main theme here, which is man's helplessness in the face of the almighty forces of nature. Even the 2 lesser-known tales here I thought were great, particularly The Man Whom the Trees Loved, which I think is almost on the same level as the 2 classics I've already mentioned. Ancient Sorceries, on the other hand, is a little bit of a step down, but I still thought it was thoroughly original and enjoyable. So in short, I was completely blown away, and I'm definitely going to be checking out much more of this author's work in the future. And the next entry on this top 10 is the second non-fiction one. And this is Not Your China Doll, The Wild and Shimmering Life of Anna May Wong by K.T.G. Salisbury. Now, if you don't know who Wong was, she was the first Chinese-American film star who first reached fame in the 1920s in silent pictures before successfully making the transition in the early 30s to the talkies. Now, this was clearly a labour of love for this author, no question about it. The level of research is breathtaking. both on Wong herself and also on the times in which she lived, thereby putting her fame into the context it deserves. Now, crucially, Salisbury doesn't overemphasise the breaking down barriers and cultural significance of Wong's success. Of course, she does address it because it's there, it's plain to see. But she's more focused on Wong's personal journey, and what an incredible journey it was. And there's also an alternate version of Hollywood history here, which is quite fascinating if you're interested in the subject. Now, if you want to check out Wong's big screen adventures, personally I'd recommend Daughter of the Dragon, Java Head and Shanghai Express, all from the early 1930s. But this book is one of those cases where you don't have to be a fan of the person involved, and you don't have to be invested in the subject of the book to really enjoy it and get something from it. What could have been a dry academic exercise instead is the wild and shimmering ride that the title promises. A hugely enjoyable tribute to a remarkable woman and highly recommended. Now, the next entry on the list is the only one I don't have a physical copy of. This was a digital read, part of a collection of stories and novels I got for my Kobo by a guy called R. Austin Freeman. And I specifically bought this pack so I could read his tales of one of the first forensic detectives, Dr. Thorndyke. But right in the middle of it, there was this odd standalone novel called The Uttermost Farthing, or A Savant's Revenge. This novel tells the tale of Humphrey Challoner, a respected scholar and anatomist whose wife is murdered by an unknown assailant during a robbery gone wrong. When the authorities can't track down the miscreant, Humphrey decides to do it himself and embarks on a 20-year vendetta, along the way dealing out deadly justice to any number of criminals who he feels may have fired that fatal shot. Obtaining each corpse after death, he hangs the skeleton in his private anatomy museum and shrinks the heads, which he keeps in a nice collection. Now, this is a macabre tale of obsession and revenge, told in the first person by Challoner through his journals, which are unearthed after his death. It's a striking subject for a novel first published in 1914, although, as we've seen already in this video, not a completely original idea. What is different, however, is hearing the events in the voice of the serial killer himself. This gives it a very modern and very unusual flavour. Challoner's approach to his long-term scheme is so matter-of-fact and so deadpan that not only do his actions begin to seem quite reasonable in a way, but they also verge into the realms of black comedy. One scene finds him travelling on a public train with a severed head in a bag, which he leaves in the luggage rack overhead. It's then picked up by mistake by another passenger, and Challoner has to chase after him. The fact that this passenger is also an elderly vicar does really lend a sense of Hitchcockian humour to the whole idea. It's hard not to believe that Freeman was having a little ghoulish fun at his reader's expense. Now, there's little information out there on how this book was received at the time, but I have read that his publishers Hodder and Stoughton initially refused to publish it, and some critics apparently called it morally repulsive. As far as I can tell, public reaction seems to have been split between people who found it hard to stomach and those who admired its darkly comic tones. But I do find it surprising that such a novel would be published by a successful author in England at the time. After all, the Dr. Thorndyke stories, okay, they have their moments, but they're no more gruesome than Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes tales, which were the obvious inspiration for them. It's bold, it's different, and by turns it's very disturbing and rather funny, although perhaps I should qualify that and say you have to have a sort of twisted sense of humour like me to fully appreciate it. But I'd recommend it anyway. Next on the list is Nightcry by William L. Stuart, and I've already done a full review of this one on the channel, so check that out if that sounds interesting to you. Now, this forgotten noir is about hard-boiled cop Mark Deglin, who kills a murder suspect during an interrogation. It's an accident, but he decides to cover it up and dispose of the body. Now, this is a bleak urban noir set in a cold concrete landscape, peopled by weary men of few words who've seen too much. And Stuart brilliantly nails this atmosphere of post-World War II disillusion and dislocation. Deglin is far from the most sympathetic of protagonists, but it's a testament to Stuart's skill as a writer that we stay invested in his fate and his scheme and his eventual partial redemption. Now, and although that redemption does give the book a strangely inconclusive feel at its climax, it is a redemption that feels genuine, authentic and hard-earned. The book was turned into the classic noir movie Where the Sidewalk Ends in 1950. And although the impact of the novel is understandably a little watered down for the movie, it's still a fine film. The changes mostly revolved around efforts to make the main character seem more sympathetic, but it's a testament to the fine performance of Dana Andrews and the rest of the cast that you can kind of forgive it and still enjoy both pieces of media on different levels. But in the end, this is a tight, riveting noir novel which, once it gets you in its grip, it doesn't let you go. I liked it so much that after finishing it, I promptly picked it up again and read the whole thing through for a second time, and that is something I almost never do. So we're coming to the end of the list now, and it's time for my favourite non-fiction book of the year. And this was a fairly easy decision to make because this is Dutch Girl, Audrey Hepburn and World War II by Robert Matzen. Now, at first glance, this is simply a biography of Hollywood actress Audrey Hepburn, her teenage years when she grew up in the occupied Netherlands during World War II. But it is so much more than that. It's a stunning depiction of a country and a community under occupation, through the focus of one family whose daughter just happened to grow up to be one of the most famous women in the world. Matzen's devotion to this project saw him go so far as to even visit the town of Velp in the Netherlands, where most of the action takes place. And he also interviewed as many survivors as he could find from the town and from that time. And his hard work, effort and dedication shines through on every page of the finished book. The hook here is that the 14-year-old Audrey Hepburn started working for the resistance, carrying messages and helping Allied pilots who had crashed in the area to evade capture. She also performed at dance recitals to help raise money for the cause, and she carried on doing all this right under the Nazis' noses for 2 years until the end of the war. And if that's not remarkable enough, Hepburn's parents were old-school aristocrats and Nazi sympathisers. In fact, her father spent the majority of the war in jail in England because he'd been operating as a low-level Nazi spy in London. Her mother was a friend to the well-known British fascists, the Mitford sisters, and had even met Adolf Hitler, finding him to be apparently a thoroughly nice chap. She even wrote some propaganda pieces for the British press, from a pro-Nazi angle. In mitigation, it is worth mentioning that she did actually switch sides later on in the conflict when she got some first-hand experience of the Nazis' methods. And she did assist with some of the covert resistance activity in Velp, although understandably she was never completely trusted. But beyond all that, this is simply a thoroughly absorbing slice of 20th century history, brought home through the lives and sufferings of a small community in the Netherlands. I found all the details endlessly fascinating and the story remarkably human. World War II history isn't normally a subject that would pop up on my radar in any way. I am an Audrey Hepburn fan, I confess, which is why I picked up the book. But you really don't have to have seen any of her films or even know who she is to appreciate this remarkable piece of work. It's just a great example of bringing history to life, and I'd recommend it without reservation. So now we've come to the end, my favourite fiction book of the year. Now if you asked me on another day, you might get another selection from this list. But today, on the day of shooting, my choice is Moonrise by Theodore Strauss. Now this is the tale of Danny Hopkins, a man regarded as poor white trash by the occupants of the small town of Bradford. His only real friends are a deaf-mute boy and an old black man who lives out at a crumbling plantation on the edge of town where he works as the caretaker. When he was a child, Danny's father was hung for murder, and the town won't let him forget it. Particularly Jerry Sykes, the entitled son of the town's banker. When Danny and Jerry get into a fight on the night of a dance, Danny overreacts and kills him with a rock. It's self-defense, but he fears that no one will believe him, so he hides the body in the nearby swamp. And that's really just about all the plot that you get, because this forgotten noir novel isn't about femme fatales or flying bullets. It isn't about cracking dialogue, snap-brim hats, cops, gangsters, and anything like that. It's about one man and his struggle with rage, doubt, fear, paranoia, guilt and shame, and he tries to navigate the small town that despises him. It's a quiet, almost small story, but Strauss works in some big themes here and pulls them all together with a masterful hand. I was so invested in this story because it felt so genuine and so immediate. The struggle between Danny's shame and his defiance is so sharply and accurately drawn, as is the superbly detailed backdrop of the small town milieu that he has to navigate. The supporting cast of characters never descend into cliché, but they are all recognisable and highly believable types. And all of this is wrapped up in Strauss's wonderful and beautiful evocative writing style. And this one was a real surprise to me because I saw the 1948 movie adaptation many years ago, and although it's not bad, I didn't think it was anything particularly memorable, so I didn't have great hopes for the book. I was just completely blindsided by its brilliance. And I have little hesitation in putting this at my number one, although, as I say, on a different day, a couple of the other contenders might have pipped it. So that's it for the video. That is my top 10 reads for the year of 2025. Have you read any of them? What did you think of them? What were your top 10 reads of the year? And are there any of them that you think I might like? I welcome any suggestions. Please drop them in the comments below. I'm always interested in discovering new authors. So have a happy new year, everyone, and a great 2026. I hope you'll be joining me again next year. And just remember, keep digging through those bargain bins and visiting those obscure backstreet second-hand bookshops, because there are treasures out there that only you can find. Cheers.